We turn now to our panel for some analysis. Susan Glasser covers the presidency and foreign policy for The New Yorker, and David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Good to have you here. It was interesting to have Bob Gates take us around the world. All these hot spots seem to be bubbling up this week. A lot on the Trump administration's plate. David, from your reporting with the North Koreans and this round of testing, what are they looking for here? Is it a third summit? What are they trying to pressure?
The North Korean strategy has long been, if they're not getting the kind of attention from the United States that they want, they act this way and they start to sort of press the boundaries. Now we're seeing, since the breakdown of the talks in Hanoi without a deal, increasing signals that Kim Jong-un is frustrated. He wants Donald Trump to re-engage. How they re-engage is not clear. The U.S. side says they've sent feelers to Pyongyang and they're not hearing anything back. And which side sort of budges and says, okay, we're ready to renegotiate, reopen this, is unclear. And I think what you're seeing now, both with the tests by the North that have not gone so far as to force Trump to say that they're violating this ban on ballistic missile testing that he's so trumpeted as an achievement. But not just that, but now there's a seizure of the United States of a North Korea cargo ship, suggesting that the North is trying to get around the economic sanctions. Mm-hmm. This is leading to greater tensions, and how they sort of break through that to get back to the negotiating table is not clear, especially at a time when Trump is also engaged in this trade war with China, and he's trying to keep the Chinese support on this sanctions regime.
And the UN said that 40% of the North Korean population is near starving right now. I mean, they're really getting squeezed by these sanctions. Does delivering food aid violate the maximum pressure campaign, Susan? Does the president have a way around this?
Well, I think he does. And the other thing is that President Trump has shown that he really won't be bound by many of the constraints anyways, that in the past he's not, as you know, one of those people who in his negotiations insists on consistency at the expense of all other virtues, right? And so in this situation, I agree with David that the North Koreans are really looking to pressure the United States in some way back to the table. Kim Jong-un is essentially launching these missiles. He's given a deadline, interestingly, of the end of the year for there to be some sort of progress here. And, what's striking is that President Trump, although he suffered what looks like an embarrassment, the collapse of this summit, his theory of the case that the North Koreans would respond to his pressure differently than the three previous U.S. administrations. That hasn't paid off either. Trump has been pretty unwavering in his very, very public desire to go back to the table as well. So I think that, once again, we're seeing it's much easier to blow up deals than it is to make them, despite Trump believing that he's a great deal maker.
And David, while the president has said these short-range missile tests don't violate his sense of trust with Kim Jong-un, that's got to make Japan and South Korea a little nervous.
Absolutely. You just had the Prime Minister of Japan here a few weeks ago. He's taken a really hard line on these talks, in contrast to what's happening with the president of South Korea. So there's a split among U.S. allies. Tokyo and Seoul do not see this the same way. It's certainly concerning for the Japanese that they're relaunching these sort of shorter-range missiles, projectiles, new weapons that Kim Jong-un talks about, and it's unclear, what. But it also sends a signal that the North Korea is continuing to make progress on its overall weapons system. And this is something that, as this thing drags out, there's a sense that the North Koreans, of course, they want to end to sanctions. There are, major issues with the economy, and that's troubling for Kim Jong-un and his long-term future. But I think over time, there's the idea that North Korea likes these talks because they continue to drag this out in a way that gives them more time.
Susan, on Iran, that was another flashpoint this week. The Pentagon sent anti-missile battery, B-52 bombers, an amphibious ship, combat helicopters, aircraft carrier. What is this buildup aimed at?
Well, look, you talk about maximum pressure. I think that is the goal right now of the administration. But again, on North Korea, on Iran, we haven't talked about Venezuela yet, China. What you see, I think, across a broad number of fronts is that people are so eager to find a Trump doctrine in foreign policy. There is no Trump doctrine in foreign policy, right? And, if you will lose yourself all day long trying to figure out why are they tough and talking about human rights here, but on the other hand, with North Korea, talking about embracing a dictator. In Iran, we're looking at 1 year after the president blew up the Iran deal, walked away from this accord that was negotiated not only by the United States, but its key allies and partners. So you could say, well, we're just seeing the inevitable unraveling of that previous agreement. That's what's happening right now. But I think that it really connects back to the great uncertainty about what the Trump administration policy is in the Middle East more broadly, right? You have this situation in Syria where the Iranians are there on the side of the Syrian regime. You have the Russians there as well. Interestingly, you could say that President Trump has a very hardline policy in many of these places, and the only question is whether he himself actually supports it.
It's a great point, because I was going to say that, Trump undercuts his aide so often. We've seen that from the start of the administration. They're speaking out of two sides of their mouth. And there was the idea that Trump is building the maximum pressure on Iran like he did with Pyongyang, and the goal being that Trump himself would then get to the negotiating table with the Iranians. And Trump himself said, call me. He said, call me right after John Bolton was suggesting there was a new hard line in place. And so, what I think is interesting also in the end of the Iran deal on the nuclear weapons, the allies have been cut out of the U.S. policy and the U.S. approach, and Trump believes himself to be the great deal maker. Only I can fix this. You've seen him do that with North Korea, now with Iran potentially, and of course with China, where he got a lot of kudos for a harder line policy on Chinese economic practices, what a lot of allies believe is predatory, but he's cut out the allies in sort of building the pressure on China and even negotiating.
I thought it was interesting talking to Bob Gates that he said he stands by his assessment that Joe Biden has been wrong in foreign policy for 40 years. But then he pointed out the Democratic candidates, no one's really articulating their view of what America should be doing. So all the problems you're laying out may get handed off to another commander-in-chief in 2020. Where do we pick up?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, you have President Trump, to the extent there is a unifying theme, it often has been up until now a sort of anything but Obama's foreign policy, and that was usually a pretty sure way to predict the otherwise unpredictable, right? So if President Trump saw a place and a way to undo something that Obama did, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, or to achieve something he felt Obama did not, for example, a breakthrough with North Korea, he would do it. It's very hard after 2 years, after 4 years, to make the argument that your foreign policy doctrine is just to do what the other guy didn't do. Democrats would face that problem as well. There would be enormous. President Trump is obviously extremely unpopular with the Democratic base. So simply arguing that you would do differently than Trump may be enough of a foreign policy argument. Generally speaking, American voters aren't looking for a consistent worldview and doctrine from their presidential candidates as much as they are focused, understandably, on the economy and what's happening here at home. But look, the bottom line is that it may suit President Trump to have Joe Biden as the nominee and to be able to once again to say, well, at least I'm cleaning up the messes from Barack Obama. Biden would be like that.
Well, we want to talk about the challenge the U.S. faces from China with former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. That's up next.